You know that face, right? The blue and white sari, Mother Teresa. For so many people, she's the ultimate symbol of charity, of pure compassion. But what if that's not the whole story? What if behind that iconic image, there's a legacy that's, well, a lot more complicated and way more controversial than most of us realize?
I mean, just listen to what Pope Francis said when she was made a saint back in 2016. He basically said her holiness feels so real, so close to us, that we just can't help but call her Mother Teresa. She's not some distant figure in a stained glass window. She feels more like family.
And yet, despite all that adoration, for decades there have been these whispers, and then not-so-whispers. Really serious questions swirling around her and her work. Accusations that paint a totally different picture. So that's the big question we're tackling today. Are these criticisms actually legit, and can we even separate the woman from the myth?
Okay, so to get our heads around this, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the official church view of her, the model of holiness. Then we're going to dive right into the serious claims that have popped up, especially around her medical care and a pretty big money scandal. And finally, we'll get into the beliefs about suffering that were at the heart of everything she did to see if we can make sense of this really, really complicated legacy.
So, let's start with that official portrait. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, she's seen as this tireless worker of mercy, a generous dispenser of divine mercy. She was this fierce defender of the unborn, the abandoned, the discarded, someone who saw God's dignity in every single person, even those left to die on the street.
All right, but now we have to turn the coin over, because running parallel to this image of sainthood, there's this really powerful counter-narrative. And it's one that's been built up over the years by journalists, former volunteers, and even some of the nuns from her own order.
And these aren't just vague complaints. The allegations are super specific and honestly pretty disturbing. We're talking claims of shockingly poor medical care, like reusing needles and not giving people painkillers. They say contagious patients weren't separated from others, that people were being baptized on their deathbeds without really consenting, and that huge amounts of donated money, sometimes from really shady people, were just not managed well.
Let's dig into that first one, because it's the one you hear about the most, the quality of care. It all boils down to this really simple but unsettling question. Were people in her facilities left to suffer when they didn't have to?
And this is where the two stories just completely crash into each other. On one side, you've got critics who see things like reused needles and no painkillers and say, that's just inexcusable, it's medical neglect. But her defenders, they have a really strong counterargument. They say, look, this was not a hospital. This was a hospice for people literally pulled off the streets of a Calcutta slum back in the 60s. And they argue that judging what they did by today's Western medical standards is just completely unfair.
Okay, so beyond the medical stuff, there are some big questions about the money. And the most famous, most well-documented case has to do with this American guy, the convicted fraudster, Charles Keating. $1.25 million. That's how much money Charles Keating donated to Mother Teresa's charity. And this is a guy who was convicted of stealing over $250 million from thousands of regular, everyday people. He even used a personalized crucifix she gave him to make himself look more trustworthy to his victims.
So, when Keating's on trial, who writes a letter to the judge? Mother Teresa. And it's the Judge Lance Ito from the OJ trial. In the letter, she pleads for him to be lenient. She admits she doesn't know anything about his business, but she vouches for his kindness to God's poor and asks the judge to, well, to do what Jesus would do.
And this is where it gets incredible. The prosecutor, a guy named Paul Turley, writes back, and his reply is just stunning. He explains what Keating did, that the money was stolen, and he challenges her directly. He says Jesus wouldn't keep stolen money. He'd give it back to the victims. The letter even ends by offering to put her in touch with the rightful owners so she can return it. She never wrote back.
So you have these really concrete controversies about money and medicine, and they all lead to a much deeper question, a question of belief. Because, to really get a handle on her actions and the criticism of those actions, we have to understand the theological idea that was at the absolute heart of her mission.
And that concept is called redemptive suffering. It's a Catholic belief that says human suffering, if you accept it and offer it up to God, can actually have value. It can bring you closer to Jesus and even help save souls. So for Mother Teresa and her followers, this wasn't about being cruel. It was a deeply spiritual act. Helping someone have a beautiful death was the goal. But you can imagine her critics saw this very, very differently. Her fiercest opponent, the late Christopher Hitchens, saw this theology in a much darker light.
He argued that she wasn't actually trying to alleviate suffering, she was glorifying it. From his perspective, the poor weren't being served at all. They were just being used as props to expand her fundamentalist worldview.
So you have all these serious documented controversies, and yet the Catholic Church formally recognized her as a saint. How does that happen? Well, it's not random. There's a very formal step-by-step process.
It basically has 4 main stages. First, you're named a servant of God. That happens when a bishop opens a cause for your sainthood. Usually there's a 5-year waiting period after death, but they waive some of that for her. Second, you become venerable. That's when the Pope says, yep, this person lived a life of heroic virtue. Third, you're called blessed. This happens after a first miracle is investigated and officially approved. And finally, you become a saint after a second approved miracle.
Which brings us right back to where we started. We're not left with one clear picture, are we? We're left with 2 completely different portraits of the exact same person.
On the one hand, you've got Pope Francis calling her a generous dispenser of divine mercy, a true model of holiness. And on the other, you have someone like Christopher Hitchens, who literally called her a charlatan, a friend to dictators, and someone who actually promoted suffering.
So, in the end, this whole debate is far from over. For millions of people, her mission is still this powerful, eloquent witness to faith. But for her critics, it's more like a cautionary tale, a story about the dangers of dogmatic belief and what can happen with the power of a personality cult.
And that leaves us with a really tough question, right? When we look at a figure like Mother Teresa, how should we remember her? Do we focus on her intentions, on the faith that drove her? Or do we focus on the impact, on the documented controversies that surrounded her work? How you answer that? Well, it really defines not just her legacy, but what we value in our heroes.